It's been a defining moment. The voices of Australian women calling out violence and inequality. But what's really changing? Now, a national summit will test our political leaders and their response. Welcome to Q&A. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm David Spears and we're coming to you live from Melbourne tonight. And joining me on the panel, the Professor of Australian Indigenous Studies, Marcia Langton. In Canberra, Australian Federal Police Commissioner, Reece Kershaw. In Hobart, Australian of the Year, Tame. From Parliament House in Canberra, the Minister for Women's Safety, Anne Ruston. And in Adelaide, Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister, Wong. Great to have you all here. And remember, you can stream us live on iView and all the socials. Quanda is the hashtag. Please join the debate and share what you're thinking. Our first question tonight comes from Caitlin Bell.
My experience of the legal system as it deals with sexual assault is that it's full of men. And the police, the people in the police and the legal teams haven't had adequate mental health training or training in trauma response. So my question is, when are we going to make reporting a rate a victim-centred experience? And why can't we have more female practitioners to help the victim throughout the entire process?
Now, some states have made a bit of progress on this, I think New South Wales and Queensland in particular. But Tame, let me come to you. How common is this concern expressed about the difficulty in the process of coming forward to make a complaint?
Oh, look, it's so common, so unfortunately common. I, in my role as an advocate, am constantly speaking with survivors who share this same experience, and my own experience when I reported the pedophile to police 11 years ago. I had to make a statement in the room to a man, and there was clearly a lack of trauma information in his training, because every time, and there were a lot of incidents of rape that I had to describe in my experience. And every time that I said, and he raped me, I had to qualify that, and I had to actually stop, and he would ask me, so do you mean that he put his penis in your vagina? And I would have to say that every time. And so I was constantly being interrupted. And as well, just throughout the process beyond that, beyond dealing with the police, it was an experience of feeling like the asymmetries of power mimicked the experience that I had in the actual trauma itself.
And has it improved at all, do you know, since your experience?
As far as I hear from the people that I speak to daily, it hasn't.
Reece Kershaw, we heard from Caitlin in the question there, the need for a victim-centred experience. Is that what victims can really expect these days, in your view?
Yeah, look, from an AFP point of view, I can say that we do train our officers to be victim-centric, and I think we have improved in sharing what's best practice and really understanding the process and explaining the process to victims. And I think that's an ongoing effort. We'll continually learn and understand, and that's one thing that I think law enforcement has been able to do, is listen to victims and understand that different approaches need to be made in relation to addressing those needs. And that's why for us now, in sexual assault and domestic violence, the victim often drives the process. What
does that look like, though, in practice, to come to the concerns that Grace just detailed for us there? What does that actually manifest as?
I think it goes back to first response general duties versus the specialist teams. I think the general duties officers now are having to have more training in mental health and other issues which we're facing a lot of mental health incidents that police attend. But the specialist teams, I know, are the ones that understand this particular crime and the complexities and how difficult and challenging it can be, especially for the victims if their expectations are not met or they feel as though they haven't been respected enough or listened. And I think that's really important, that You know, I'm here tonight to listen and understand. I know that my fellow commissioners are the same. We're always wanting to learn and get better. And I think that's the honest approach that police are taking now, is that we'll accept the criticism and learn from it.
Professor Langton, let me ask you, the difficulty and indeed the trauma involved for some women in coming forward is one reason why they may be hesitant. But you've also been involved in research into why, in particular, a lot of Indigenous women don't come forward. What have you found?
Well, just in response to Caitlin's question, I just want to say a group of us Aboriginal women in this area, working in this area, met just this year online with an Assistant Police Commissioner in the Queensland Police Force and the First Nations police officers who deal with these matters. And I found that a very encouraging experience. They clearly understand the issues, and I just want to say every police force in Australia needs a unit like theirs.
So you're seeing progress there?
I saw progress in that one instance in this unit in Queensland led by an Assistant Police Commissioner, and I'm saying every jurisdiction needs this kind of unit.
From that. But more broadly, your research goes to why Indigenous women are worried about coming forward amidst fears of losing their kids.
Yes, well, there are thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children in out-of-home care, precisely because when women, Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander women, make a call to the police for help, it immediately triggers, especially here in Victoria, the child protection authorities who arrive and almost universally conclude that the children are not safe because a woman has asked for help in a family violence or domestic violence or sexual assault case and remove the children. They, at the very least, put the children in a situation of being, you know, substantiated on notice, and they are inevitably removed. And this is why most Aboriginal women now and Torres Strait Islander women will not report family or domestic violence or sexual assault because of the risk of having their children removed. And this, everybody knows that this is the case, and so the perpetrators of violence weaponise this behaviour of the police and the child protection system and hold that over the woman and make her extremely vulnerable to even further violence and also her children. Again, another problem is that women themselves are hysterical if they've been assaulted, sexually assaulted, especially in front of their children, and in cases of extreme violence, because of their trauma, the police arrest them and not the perpetrator. The police believe the perpetrator of the violence and remove the woman, and so now we see skyrocketing rates of Aboriginal women incarcerated in prison precisely because they called in to the police.
But this is appalling. What's the answer to that?
Better police training, First Nations police units like the one that I met online in Brisbane, and I think, frankly, racism is a huge part of the problem. So every social worker in the child protection system just about will conclude that Aboriginal children are at risk and remove them, and there's no triaging of this problem. They don't think, well, what is the risk to removing the children from their mother? So what we find is that it can take women at the minimum 2 years to get their children back. And so the children are in the first instance traumatised by the violence, by the intimate partner. Then they're traumatised by being removed from home. And at a minimum, they will be in out-of-home care for 2 years. And the mother then is, you know, doubly traumatised. She's been assaulted, her children have been removed, and then there's the long struggle to get her children back. So families are falling apart because of the assumption that children are automatically at risk. They the authorities need to move women and children to a safe place immediately and not separate children from their mothers.
Reece, Kershaw, let me just come back to you quickly on this. Before becoming AFP Commissioner, you were the Police Commissioner in the Northern Territory. Do you accept what Marcia Langton's talking about here, the need for better training for police on the ground in dealing with these situations?
Yeah, I think we can always improve, but I do know that part of that includes having Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders join the police force, and their pathways now, I know the whole country's working towards having better representation of Aboriginal people in the police force. That's really important to understand the cultural issues. There are deep-seated cultural issues that go on in those Indigenous communities, and the rates of sexual assault and domestic violence is just simply incredible. In one occasion, I can tell you, there was a house that everyone thought there was only 6 people that lived in that house. There was actually 26, and in that house, reciprocal domestic violence orders, a child sex offender. The list went on. Average criminal history was 50 each per person. So the young children growing up in that household had no chance. So we know that there needs to be a lot of work about sharing information from all agencies and working together, and also be better representative of the community that we serve.
Well, we're going to come to the issues around housing a little later, but our next question comes from Tony Donino.
The Gaetjens inquiry into whom knew about the Brittany Higgins allegation in the Prime Minister's office has stalled yet again, and the blokey culture continues unabated. So, does the panel think that the upcoming Women's Summit is for real? Or is it yet again another spin-based delay tactic by our Prime Minister? Thank you.
All right, well, there's a bit in this question. Anne Ruston, Minister, I can see, Grace, you've got your hand up there. Did you want to just add something very quickly before I ask the Minister?
Yeah, I find it very interesting that, it's taken this long for them to figure out, or they haven't even figured out still who did what or who knew what when inside Parliament. I mean, get me in there with a lie detector and I'll tell you within a day.
So this is the Gaetjens inquiry, just to let people know, looking at who in the Prime Minister's office knew what about the alleged rape of Brittany Higgins. It's been suspended based on advice from the DPP in the ACT. Anne Ruston, do you think we'll ever find out the answer, though, as to who knew what when? And will this report ever be made public, do you think?
Well, look, thanks, David. In answer to Tony's question around why the report is not, or the investigation is not currently on foot, it is because we have been requested not to undertake any further investigations while the police inquiry is underway, and that's the reason why it is stopped at the moment. But I also wanted to absolutely assure Tony and everybody that's listening, and that is that we are absolutely serious about making sure that this National Safety Summit is able to bring together the culmination of all the consultation around getting the information for the next national plan, because as a government I can absolutely commit that we are serious about changing the dial, not just about continuing to support frontline services, but to actually make a difference by stopping domestic violence, family violence and sexual violence before it starts.
Yeah, we're going to come to the summit, but just to be clear, I appreciate it's been suspended based on a request from, or advice from, the DPP, but will it ever be made public, do you think?
Well, obviously we have to wait for Brittany's case to go through the appropriate channels, and when it has done that, then obviously that's the time to have these discussions. But obviously at the moment we're operating under the instruction or the request of the police.
Sorry, Grace.
I just have a question. How can this government seriously claim to care about women's safety and children's safety when it won't even be accountable for and swiftly and directly address the issue of sexism within its own ranks?
Penny Wong, let me bring you in here. You've been pursuing this report, which we're yet to see from the head of the Prime Minister's Department, Phil Gaetjens. Do you accept that they are right to pause it on this request from the DPP or not?
Well, first I just want to say thank you to Grace for her extraordinary advocacy, which I think is helping with many other voices to change the country, and thank you, Marcia, for reminding us of what so much that needs to be done with in our First Nations communities, with our First Nations peoples. Can we just start with why the Gaetjens report was commissioned in the first place? Because I think that goes to the Prime Minister, to Mr Morrison's sincerity. The Gaetjens report was commissioned in the first place because the Prime Minister didn't want to just ask his staff who knew what when. So our issue, and I suspect the issue of many men and women around Australia, is that we had an appalling alleged assault in Parliament House. We had, as Ms Higgins said herself, she felt like she was a political problem to be managed. And instead of the government fronting up and trying to deal with this issue honestly and openly, we had a flurry of inquiries, including one which avoided Mr Morrison having to ask his own staff what they knew. And I do not think that meets the sorts of standards that Tony, in the question, and I think more broadly, as the Australian people want.
Reece Kershaw, I'll just get a quick comment from you on this. Are they right to pause this inquiry in your view or not?
Oh, look, there's two processes. We were very concerned to make sure that the police investigation, there was no problematic intersection or attempt to interfere, and we were able to compile that brief of evidence. It now goes into a prosecution phase, which is the Director of DPP in the ACT, and that's on him and his advice. So we were able to complete that investigation in the way that we wanted it to be able to do, which was in what we would call a sterile corridor. Which means stopping this inquiry for now. Well, I think the DPP has made that decision, and, yes, and I haven't been consulted or been contacted on that. So the other part of Tony's question is obviously about the summit. Minister, let me come back to you on this. What are the KPIs, are there any, for this summit? What does it need to achieve?
Well, the summit's most important achievement that it needs to achieve is to bring together a culmination of all the consultation, to put on the stage people who are experts so that the Australian public can have the opportunity to come and have a look at the issues that are confronting those people that are trying to deal with family, domestic and sexual violence in our country at the moment. And so the most important thing, I think, is to hear the voices of everybody who wants to be heard. That's why we've made sure that we're live streaming all the panels that are going to be on Monday and Tuesday. We've now we've got a feedback link on our website so that people can provide information about their views, their thoughts, whether it be about the summit or whether it be about their own experiences. But we want to make sure that we have used every tool that we possibly can to get every Australian the opportunity to be able to have their say about this really important issue.
Yeah, well, Penny Wong, is that enough? Is that what this summit should be about, or do you think there should be a higher ambition?
Well, I think there should be a higher ambition, which is achieving change. And I would hope that it's not just words. We can talk about absolutely wanting to do something or absolutely believing in something, but ultimately the government will be judged on what change ultimately flows from this summit. And I think, my view is, yes, we want the voices of survivors and victims heard. Secondly, we don't just want a to-do list for the states, which is all too often Mr Morrison's go-to answer, a to-do list for someone else. There ought to be a comprehensive response particularly for all the areas for which the Commonwealth has responsibility. And I hope, and I'll defer to Grace and others who have more expertise, but I hope there is a comprehensive response which goes to prevention, early intervention, crisis and recovery. We need a comprehensive response in which the Commonwealth actually steps up to do something.
Grace, Tame, you are going to be involved in this summit. What would you like it to achieve?
Look, I am involved in this summit, and in fact, earlier today I participated in a roundtable discussion. I was one of 49 people, and I was the only lived experience survivor there. So I think that says something about the prioritisation of survivor voices.
What does it say?
It says that we're not really being prioritised when you think about it. There was also only one man in 49 people there, and it sort of makes you feel like, all right, well, here are these women's issues, so we'll just make the women deal with them by themselves. Also, the summit is on Monday and Tuesday, and it's only been this week that we've received confirmation of how it's all structured. It's all been quite secretive and confusing in the way that it's structured. And although I am a self-proclaimed optimist and I'm acting in good faith, and I really do believe that any step is a good step, but there was a glaring lack in the discussion today, and that is the focus on prevention. So much of this is reactivity. Let's put a Band-Aid on this. Let's respond to this. Where's the prevention? And I mean, I was in this discussion with people from the sector who are experts, who have been working for decades, who, the work has been done. It's there. There are evidence-based solutions, there are evidence-based methods of prevention that are ready to be implemented. It's just a question of political will, really, at this point.
Well, Minister, let me get your response to, I guess, the criticism and concern raised by Grace Tame there.
Well, obviously, I'm concerned about Grace's comments from today, but what I would say is there are a number of roundtables, and all of them have got different purposes to make sure that we can cover such an extraordinary wide range of different issues that domestic and family and sexual violence needs to cover. Because whilst the first plan was very focused around raising awareness and dealing with domestic violence in probably a much more simplified form, this next national plan has to address all of the complexities that domestic violence, family violence and sexual violence occurs in as we're going forward. We also would, I'd say that we have been very, very conscious around making sure we have heard the voices of people who are victim survivors. Monash University is actually holding dedicated roundtables specifically with victim survivors, many of whom have asked not to be named, and many have asked if they can do it in the privacy of a one-on-one conversation with the consultants. We also, I spoke today with a group of survivors who are participating in the summit on Monday and Tuesday. They've raised a whole heap of really interesting ideas about things that we could do to make sure that the issues that survivors believe need to be embedded in the things that we have to do. And I would go to Penny and say we absolutely do need to move the dial on this. And I pay tribute to the former Prime Minister Julia Gillard when she actually made that really amazing decision to actually put the first plan in place back in 2010. But what we've got now in front of us is an opportunity to build on that work that she put in place in 2010. And you're right, Grace, we absolutely have to make sure that this is not just a talk fest, that things that come out of this summit actually deliver the real change that you're talking about. And that's why we're doing it. But this isn't the end of the conversation about the next plan. This is the end of the consultation, and then we all need to get together and work out, every single person in Australia, about how we are going to collectively and individually make a difference.
Marcia Langton, from what you know of this summit and the national plan, the new 12-year plan to begin next year, is it on the right track or is something missing?
I want to agree with Grace. We really need to hear from the victims. So we did a literature survey a couple of years ago. And I have to tell you that most of what let's call it the industry that serves the victims, and many of them are very good people and they do their best, but as with any institutional arrangement, what happens is that there's an industry view, and it's often a closed view, and the victims' views are not heard. So, for instance, just to give you an example, what we found was that, well, from looking at some data and lining it up with all the interviews that we'd done with victims, there's a pattern, and the pattern is, let me describe it, young women go into their first intimate relationship. The person is abusive and violent. They know very little about the situation they're in. They're not able to make decisions. They don't have enough support. They don't know where to go. By the time they figure it out, in the cases that we've come across, they are maimed, traumatised, damaged for life, lost their children, And then they are targeted by yet another abuser, and so you have a pattern of serial abuse. There are serial abusers who go from young woman to young woman, and they are the most violent people in the community, and the police data shows it. And at least 2 police forces are now aware of this pattern, and it would not have come to the surface without the victims being believed and listened to, and then you start to see these patterns. So this, you know, it's possible to do something about these serial abusers, and the Queensland Police Force has picked up on it, and they've announced that they're tracking them. Well, and this needs to happen in every police force. And we need to listen to the victims because they often alert us to patterns that we're not aware of and behaviours that we're not aware of. And so, for instance, another one is that perpetrators come back and abuse them again, even though the matter's been to court, the police have been involved, there are orders, because the orders of the court, say for anger management, men's healing programs, that's the slippery slope. That's where men slip through the system. There's no accountability. These men's healing programs are not evaluated sufficiently, and then the perpetrators go straight back and abuse their victims again. So this is another pattern that hasn't been picked up on. So I want to see good research, good data, available, accessible, so that we can hear what is happening to the victims.
Grace, just quickly.
Yeah, further to that, the real specific gap, and Marcia's sort of touched on it there, the real specific gap in the conversation in our education is around this issue of control. So obviously in the domestic violence space, we call it coercive control. When it's child sexual abuse, we call it grooming. That still isn't understood widely enough. And when we understand those processes, that's when we can really start to break down this issue of control. But I wonder whether this government is able to actually face that issue of control because it's got its own issue with abuse of power in its own ranks. And so that's a concern that I have.
Just on the issue of grooming, and you mentioned child exploitation as well, because Grace Tame, you're now involved in this Stop the Stigma campaign. I just wanted to get some thoughts on this from you and the Commissioner. You know, we talk about victims not being heard. Kids, it is often a very uncomfortable subject for a lot of grown-ups to talk about, particularly with their children. What is this campaign about? What should parents be looking for, particularly with so many kids online at the moment through lockdowns? And what should they be saying to their kids?
You want me to answer
you
or
go
Reece?
first. You go first there, Grace.
Well, the campaign is the first project that brings together NGOs in the space, as well as lived experience survivors, and of course ACE, the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation. And really what it's aimed at is continuing to normalise the conversation, to shift the shame away from survivors to the predatory behaviour, to break the silence. Because as we know, silence and secrecy, these are weapons of evil. Evil thrives in silence. And when we start to break down the silence and share the stories, not only do we shift the shame, but again, we are able to understand and we're able to educate better, and we get the really specific details that you can only get from lived experience, you know, about the grooming and those sorts of patterns.
So, Commissioner, just what is going on? What are the figures showing over the last 12 months in particular through COVID, and what should parents be looking for?
Yeah, I think if victims are brave enough to speak out, we need to be brave enough as a community to listen and act. And through COVID, we certainly saw a huge increase in the number of children being exploited online and groomed, and those images being exchanged at record numbers. It's just absolutely horrifying. I think going back to the Stop the Stigma, you know, 1 in 10 Australian families are probably not prepared to, according to our data, not prepared to actually talk about it. It's too, you know, confronting. I think we need to have that conversation, and these images and what's actually occurring are absolutely horrific, and they're ones that those conversations need to be had by all the families, because what you often find, in my own experience, is that someone suspects, someone knows. You've got to speak out, and then you've also got to educate your kids. I think part of it is being, and we've been saying this for a long time, be connected to your children and understand what's happening online and look for those indicators that Grace is talking about. You know, where it might be a Australia Post package that turns up for a young child, you know, often that can be a phone for someone and disguised as something else, and the male groomer is actually then doing contact with them without the parents understanding. So it's really being connected to your child, looking for different behaviours and what they're actually doing on the internet. Also, even gaming. We're seeing predators use the gaming chat rooms, a whole range of techniques. So the ACE does have that website which people can go to learn and understand, but we do have to start having the conversation that, you know, children are at risk. It's a dangerous playground, the internet. It's not like your normal playground that we're used to actually policing. As parents and carers and guardians, the internet's actually quite dangerous, and it's not being monitored well enough, I think, by families and relatives and so on. And
look, if any of this particular discussion has raised issues for you or anyone you know, you can get help from the Kids Helpline. There's the number, 1800 555 1800. Our next question comes from Eileen Cullerton.
My 20-year-old sister Anne-Marie Cullerton was raped and murdered by Jonathan Bakewell. Despite being given a life sentence with no parole, the laws were changed in 2004 and his sentence was reduced to just 20 years. Since his release, he has breached parole 4 times. I recently launched a national law reform campaign and petition calling for uniform sentencing for the crime of murder with sexual assault to be made a standalone crime, carrying a mandatory life sentence with no parole, to keep women safe. Given Australia's national crisis of violence against women, do you believe it is time for uniform sentencing laws for violent crimes against women? And do you believe it is time for stronger sentencing to send the message that Australia does not tolerate violence against women?
Grace, Tame, to you first on this one.
Yes, I think the answer is yes. That's part of the solution is harsher sentences, but I come back to the issue of prevention. We really need to be having the conversations as early as possible with our children, who are our future, about respectful behaviour, about consent, and so on and so forth, because this is just awful. And I mean, I don't often talk about this. In fact, I don't think I've ever said it publicly, but as well as being a survivor of paedophilia, and Marcia Langton was talking about this pattern as well, because I had no frame of reference after that, I got into violent relationship after violent relationship. I mean, I lived with a man who used to punch holes in the walls, spit in my eyes, punch me in the head, choke me, you know, push me to the ground. And I can honestly say that responses and intervention and punishment doesn't really stop the problem in a lot of cases. We really need to be injecting funds and putting our attention on preventing these things from happening in the first place.
We appreciate you sharing that with us tonight, Grace. Commissioner, let me just come to you, though. To Eileen's question, and Grace is right about the need to focus on prevention. Eileen's talking, though, about tougher sentencing. Does that work? Does it help? And should we be discussing that at this summit that's coming up?
Look, I think, and I've said this before, I think child sex predators never change. And until someone can show me the research that they do, they pose an enduring threat to our community. So as far as I'm concerned, they should be on registers for life. And perhaps that's something that could be discussed, you know, those policy changes, but that's something for the government and the summit to discuss around registers and how do we look out for those dangerous sex offenders. And I know that legislation-wise, we probably do need to look at, are we uniformed and do we have the right processes and legislation to look at what Grace is talking about. Prevention is great. If we can get into the prevention space, that's the best space to be into. You know, the absence of the fear of crime is a measurement of how successful police are. And unfortunately, women are feeling less safe. And we need to make sure we get that back, capture that ground. So I think there's a number of things that can be discussed and looked at And also, as I said, information sharing too between different government departments, NGOs. We need to break those barriers down, and that's something that it's got to be built on trust, and that's going to take a while for us to have trust in the system that everyone's comfortable sharing that information.
And I want to say on this, the question was actually about uniform sentencing rather than harsher sentencing. I absolutely agree that there's a lot of work to do on uniformity in our laws and in our sentencing. So we need uniform laws across the country on, say, for instance, consent. We also need uniform laws on what constitutes domestic violence or family violence or any other type of violence that's mentioned in legislation. So there's a difference between the Victorian legislation and the New South Wales legislation, for instance. And so...
well, is that something that will be discussed, Minister, or at the summit? Because this argument around consistent uniform consent laws, just to take one example, was a big feature of the debate earlier this year. Is that something you'd like this summit to discuss and reach a settlement on?
Look, absolutely, and I think it's not just about uniform laws, because I think every woman in Australia needs to understand or needs to have the support and the confidence that no matter where she lives in Australia, the law will apply the same whichever jurisdiction that she's in. But I think it goes further than that. I think it's also around standardisation of definitions. And I think, you know, working together with the states and territories to make sure that in the first instance we actually have definitions around what each of these particular issues are is super important. And then getting nationally consistent laws in place, nationally consistent justice systems, I think is tremendously important. And the summit has a particular policing and justice component of it. Reece is actually speaking during that session, and I think it is tremendously important that we actually get the legal side of this right, because clearly it is one of the areas that there has been much concern over recent times, and you know, Grace raised it again today, that we do need to make sure that our policing and justice response is right. But can I just add to what Grace was saying before around prevention and early intervention? They are tremendously important. All three things need to happen at the same time. We need to deal with response and making sure that we've got the resources so that women who are making that really brave decision to escape a domestic violence situation have the support that they need. But equally, we need to have early intervention, and this goes to the perpetrator programs, because we know that a perpetrator who is charged with a domestic violence crime or sexual or family violence crime is likely to reappear. 50% of them will reoffend within 4 years. So we know already that we've got a group of people that we need to target, and there are some really good programs that are being run around Australia, and I think this summit gives us the opportunity to look at more of them.
We need to keep...
The last piece, David, I just wanted to add was prevention is absolutely essential. It's going to be the hardest nut to crack, and that's why we're doing things like the Stop It at the Start campaign, so that we can teach respectful behaviour and make sure that people have the confidence and the tools, so when they see bad behaviour and disrespectful behaviour, they know how to call it out.
We need to keep moving because we've got a number of questions we want to get to. I should point out, though, again, if support is available if you need it. You can get help from the 1-800-RESPECT or Lifeline, those numbers there on your screen. We're going to turn our attention, though, now to the issue of women in Afghanistan, and our next question comes from Shaima Azizi.
My name is Shaima. I'm asking this question on behalf of one of the families in Afghanistan community who has been deeply affected by the crisis there. The question is, the situation in Afghanistan is dire. While I'm grateful that the government are providing emergency visa to women at risk, these women cannot get out of the country. The Taliban everywhere, and they have no visa to other countries. How will the Australian government help these women and other Afghan women in danger before it's too late?
And I just want to add on this that we have been in touch with the Australian relatives of the family referred to there, who tell us that some, but not all in this group, have now made it out of Kabul. Penny Wong, let me come to you first on this. What should Australia be doing now to help those women who are in danger in Afghanistan?
Well, look, I'm happy to answer that, but I do want to say at the start, yeah, we were disappointed, deeply concerned, frustrated that the government did take far longer to act than it should have. When the embassy closed in May, back in May, we closed our embassy in Kabul. From that time onwards, Labor, veterans groups, the Afghan community had been calling on the government to fast-track the visa applications of those who are seeking partner and family visas, those who helped us, so people who are employed either by Australia or on Australian-funded programs, and it was manifest that the government delayed far too long on that. I'm very grateful to the ADF and Australian government personnel who participated in a very risky mission to evacuate many people. But I do think if you look back over the time frame and how many warnings and calls there were, that the government should have acted earlier. When it comes now, we are in a it's a tragic, or I think as your questioner said, a dire situation in Afghanistan for many people. No more so than for women and children. And of course the brutality of the Taliban towards women when it was previously in power is well documented. So we hope that the government can not only grant the humanitarian visas, we have space in our humanitarian visa program, but can work with partners, partner countries, to enable a safe evacuation of as many at-risk Afghans as possible. Particularly, I would focus on the women at risk, so activists and leaders.
And Senator Wong, 3,000 places this year in the refugee program. Is that enough?
No, well, look, I mean, the government didn't fill its humanitarian quota last year. And we've obviously had, given the border closures, even fewer people come to Australia this year. I don't think the government has made public yet exactly how much space there is in the program, which is, I think, around 13,000 places. So how many of those are still remaining? I would suspect there's more room. But actually, and if the government is willing to increase that. Mr Albanese, Anthony said he was very, very open to that happening. But I think the bigger issue is actually getting people here. Yeah. The bigger issue is getting people here now. And because of what has occurred and how the circumstances of the fall of the Afghan national government and the fall of Kabul and the withdrawal of the US and other allied forces, the bigger constraint on the program is not places, but actually ensuring people can be evacuated.
Well, it's very difficult. Minister, can you tell us what is the government actually doing now that those evacuation flights have stopped out of Kabul? What can be done to help those women get out of the country?
Well, can I just say to Sharma, if she wants to provide her details to your show, I'm more than happy to get my office in contact with her so that we can deal with the specific issues that she has raised today about the people that she's concerned about. But I wouldn't want to discuss that any further.
I should point out that some emergency visas were issued last night by the Australian government to this family, so they've informed us of that. So I just wanted to point that out as well. Something has been happening on this front.
Yes, of course, and the Department of Foreign Affairs has been very, very active, and like Penny, acknowledged the extraordinary efforts of our ADF forces and the people on the ground that managed to get 4,100 people uplifted out of Kabul in those extraordinary circumstances that we saw over the last couple of weeks. But going forward, the Prime Minister has said that the 3,000 visas that he announced a couple of weeks ago, they were a flaw, and we are more than there is plenty more room for which Afghan people and particularly those people that have helped Australia through the last 20 years when we've been in their country, there is more room. But it is it's a very delicate situation at the moment. As Shoma said, it's a very dire situation at the moment, and it has to be very sensitively handled. And that's why the Department of Foreign Affairs is working largely on one-on-one relationships to make sure that as many women and children and as many people as we can get out of Afghanistan. But the situation is very dire and the situation is very dangerous.
Look, it is. Commissioner Kershaw, let me ask you, we've had a lot of focus on how veterans are feeling about all that's happened in Afghanistan in recent weeks. What about police? We had about 140, I think, federal and state police who served over there, largely in training the Afghan National Police. How are they feeling now about what's happened?
Yeah, so I reached out to the 140 officers. They all are still connected to Afghanistan and have a deep respect and understanding of what some of their contacts are going through, and they're in contact with some of them 24/7. So, you know, I don't think Australia realises that we had police over there helping build capability within the Afghan National Police, and they did a fantastic job under fire sometimes at times as well, and lost some really good police officers over there. So it's a bit of sadness for those officers, and part of us is to make sure that we look after the mental health and well-being of those officers who are really affected deeply because they've still maintained a lot of those relationships. All right, let's get to our next question. It comes from Trent Candler.
Hi, this is a video for my 73-year-old mother who was too nervous to be recorded. Does the Minister realise that whilst there are many reasons for women becoming homeless in Australia, one of the major contributors is superannuation earnings? From my observation, the biggest issue is women's lack of superannuation funds due to not earning the same amount of salary for the same work in our country. It really is time to fully address this blatant discrimination. Could the Minister please comment?
So let me just run a couple of stats through here before we hear from you, Minister. We know the gender pay gap this week we saw has actually widened over the last 6 months from 13.4 to 14.2%. So women now earning about $260 a week less than men. On superannuation, men between 55, 64, the median super balance for them $183,000, for women $118,000. What is the government doing to address this?
Well, certainly one of the most important things that the government can do is to make sure that we increase women's workforce participation. Before we went into the pandemic, we saw workforce participation for women at the highest levels, and we saw the gender pay gap as small as we had ever seen it. But one of the things that we've just recently done in the budget is changes to childcare, because parents with second and subsequent children in childcare, we've increased the subsidy that they can receive for their second or any subsequent children for most families to 95%. So what we're seeking to do is to put in place options for women so that they are able to get access to the care that they need for their children so they can get back into the workforce, but at a price that is actually not a disincentive for them getting back to work. I mean, another initiative that we have put in place in the budget is the family home guarantee for single parents who are able to get access to a deposit with as low as 2% of the deposit value of the property they'd like to buy, because we know that home ownership is tremendously important when it comes to women's economic security, particularly as they get older. And just today in the Parliament, we passed legislation around making sure that we've got visibility of superannuation, because we do know that in many instances the reason that older women particularly fall on hard times is the fact that they have a marriage breakup, which often sees them with not getting their fair share of the assets from that particular partnership. Today is just another measure that says that we can now get transparency of all superannuation that the other partner earns, so she makes sure that she is actually getting her fair share of the assets. But clearly, young women today are likely to retire with much, much higher superannuation balances than those of us who haven't had superannuation for our entire lives. And that's a great thing about the superannuation guarantee. But, you know, clearly at the moment, we do know that older women particularly have much, much lower balances of superannuation than their male counterparts.
Well, I mean, this is the thing. Some of those changes might be it might help women who are at an earlier part of their career. But Penny, Wong, to you on this, women like Trent's mum, you know, buying a home isn't certainly going to be... We're talking about trying to prevent homelessness at this point. What needs to happen?
Well, a lot needs to happen. A lot should have happened over the last 8 years. But I have to say, we saw 8 years of Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison, Joyce government, including Mr Abbott appointing himself as the Minister for Women, and we saw, frankly, many of these issues not central to the government's agenda. I mean, I remember them crowing about abolishing the women's budget statement, and the point that the question goes to is women's economic security, and that is a challenge that we have to address. It is hard because it is so grounded in the inequality that exists between men and women in our society and in particularly in the economic sphere. So what can we do? Well, I'll tell you one thing you don't do, which is what the government was proposing, which is you tell women who are trying to get a home that they should when they're trying to leave violent relationships, they should raid their super to get to purchase a house or to deal with their housing costs. One thing you can do is to increase the affordable housing, so increase the number of houses that are available for women who are at risk of homelessness. And I think you referenced in your question the fact that, you know, one of the fastest growing groups when it comes to the homelessness statistics or at risk of homelessness statistics are older women.
Yeah.
What else can you do? I think you can do more on childcare, and which is why Anthony announced the policy to improve massively the economic benefit of working the 4th and 5th day for Australian parents by increasing the assistance for childcare. But, you know, for older women, I think the first thing you would do is housing, and you would try and ensure that we have more affordable or social housing available to that cohort.
Marcia Langton, just quickly to you on this. The need for crisis housing is a particularly acute one in a lot of Indigenous communities. When we talk about trying to flee violence, is enough happening? Is there improvement happening?
No. We urgently need emergency accommodation for women and their children to be housed. One, to keep them safe, two, to keep mothers and their children together. And the lack of emergency accommodation and the lack of social housing is contributing to major social problems and to the very fast spread of COVID-19 through Aboriginal communities in northwest New South Wales. All of our medical services and our Aboriginal community-controlled service sector have been saying for years that overcrowding is the key contributor to many, many problems, including family violence, child abuse, disease, infectious disease rates, and this is now a dire situation. And I cannot understand why governments don't move fast and take the advice from our Indigenous health sector on increasing emergency overcrowding. And it is indeed one of the reasons why we need our own Indigenous family violence national plan. In addition to the national plan? In addition to the national plan. I mean, we need to be mentioned in the national plan, but, you know, I'm afraid that the national plan in its various iterations has really not adequately addressed our issues. And Reece himself has said that, you know, the family violence situation in Indigenous families and communities requires special attention, and it's not just because of cultural issues. It is also because of these social and economic issues. And we need our own national plan. It needs to be devised by First Nations people, by our experts, by our frontline workers, by victims, and indeed by the very few recovered perpetrators. And I acknowledge what Reece said. There are no reformed child abusers, so I'm not talking about them. The other thing is that we need a council of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and we need proper representation on a council to address women's issues. I see there are a number of initiatives. June Oscar announced one yesterday. There are several others, but I note that our Aboriginal family violence legal services are not represented adequately. They're not represented in the National Forum. JIRA, the Aboriginal Family Violence Legal Service here in Victoria, is not being given adequate representation. And I'm very concerned, particularly because of all the legal issues, because of the differences in the way that lawyers and judges interpret what legislation means, the lack of training in our judiciary and police force and frontline and allied services. We simply have to do more because the rates, as your own program has acknowledged, of assaults on Indigenous women are 32 times higher than for the rest of the nation.
Indeed. Let's get to our next question. It comes from Dave Alton.
On this issue, the prominent woman asked that men help with the heavy lifting to make changes that bite. Don't leave it all to women. Fine. But in practical terms, what do we do? Trying to gain traction on such things can be like wrestling eels. There's much splashing about, but not much result. So, what practical suggestions are there for the man in the street, please? And what is that out there already that maybe we could tap into?
Well, Reece, Kershaw and anyone else who wants to quickly weigh in on this one, what is your advice to men? How can they make a change?
Look, just noting that Dave's from Larrakia country, I would say go and visit my friend Charlie King, who runs the No More campaign, and Charlie's an absolute legend up there, and you can look up his website. He'd love help in his campaigns about educating men, in particular in all communities, and taking action in relation to sporting teams and banning them from games when they've discovered that they have been violent towards their partner, etc., etc. But it goes beyond that, and it's the No More campaign. That's just one practical thing I think you can do. I think then also is to police those conversations that men have when they make inappropriate comments or they make slide comments about women. That's really important that we police that and say that's not appropriate, and that takes some courage, and you may not be liked anymore by that group, but perhaps that's going to change those individuals, and I think that can be a force multiplier within men. I know that we struggle to talk and share openly as men, and we've got to be better at that and say it's not appropriate, it's not right. Hey, that's not, not the right thing to say or do. So there's some practical things, and join up some of those organisations, NGOs in particular, who are struggling right now, and I'm sure they'll appreciate your input, and it could even be helping build or a women's shelter or something like that, something practical. So, but if you visit Charlie, he'll help you out.
Grace, did you have any advice to offer?
Oh, look, I'm going to come back to my key point, and then it starts with education. I mean, sexism is not ingrained in us, it's taught. But if we teach kids about respect, about consent, about meaningful values as early as possible, and that is consistent across the nation, in formal and informal education, I think that's where we've got to... That's our best bet for changing cultures.
Penny,
on anything.
Yeah, I think what Grace said.
Short and sweet. No argument.
Too easy.
There you go. Minister, how about you?
Look, I think that, everybody in Australia probably needs to just have a think about what they're saying, what they're doing, and the potential impact of those actions or those words on somebody else. And I think if everybody just takes a step back and thinks about that, then hopefully we'll actually start seeing the behaviour change that Grace is talking about. And I'll just quickly give a shout out, to organisations like the Port Adelaide football team, who are using their football players to go into schools to teach the students in schools and using their profile to make sure that they're getting the message out to children about that respectful behaviour, about consent. So I think there is so many things that every Australian could do, and what we seek to do by this next national plan is to give everybody the opportunity to play a role.
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
Thank you. I think first what Grace said, that sexism is taught. I think that is profoundly important. And the second thing I wanted to say is that I think we are at an extraordinary moment in this country's history because women like Grace and Brittany Higgins and Chanel Contos and so many others, that next generation of young feminists, of younger women, are saying, we're not copying this anymore. And I think that has caused there's been a national reckoning which their courage to speak out has demanded of the nation. And, we've got an opportunity here.
Marcia, I want to give you the final word on this. Coming back to Dave's question, what's some advice to men as to what they can do?
Well, I think the advice that Reece gave is right on, because right there in Darwin, you've got the amazing Charlie King and his program No More. I'd love to see No More rolled out right across Australia through all the sporting codes. And I've said so to the sporting codes that I had the opportunity to meet with. But yeah, I have to agree with Grace. Sexism is like racism. People aren't born sexist or racist. They learn it from their social environments. They learn it in their families, in their schools and their workplaces. What is tolerated is, you know, the standard. So we must be intolerant of sexism. We must be intolerant of abuse of women, whether it's verbal or physical or financial, or expressed in policy. But the inequities towards women, some of them have come out tonight on this program. But in Australia, such a rich country, why do we have such inequity? How can we, you know, be lecturing people elsewhere in the world about human rights when women don't have equal wages, when First Nations people, women and children are victims of violence at 32 times the rate of other Australians, and there is very little justice for victims of sexual assault, and I think an absolutely inadequate response to the victims, the child victims of sexual assault.
Well, on that note, that is all we have time for, but I would like to thank our panel for a terrific discussion this evening. Marcia Langton, Reece Kershaw, Grace Tame, Anne Ruston and Penny Wong. And thank you for all of your stories and your questions tonight. Next week, Virginia Trioli will be here for a Melbourne Writers' Week special. And on the panel, John Saffron, Julia Banks, Tony Armstrong and Rachel Doyle. And I'll see you on Insiders on Sunday. Stay safe. Good night.